My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. I'm releasing this podcast several hours before the Swedish Academy announces the winner of this year's Nobel Prize in Literature. Tan Shui, who Rob and I did an episode on way back in 2018, is the odds-on favorite to win this year, and I am shamelessly releasing this podcast, which is just a rerun of that 2018 podcast. I'm doing this entirely to capitalize on the interest in Tan Shui, and maybe in the hopes that I've gained a lot of new listeners. I'm guessing some of y'all have not heard this podcast episode from 5 years ago. I'm also hoping that if there's a journalist out there looking for a quote, they might come across the Chinese Literature Podcast in their search for Tan Shui and shoot me an email. That email is chineseliteraturePodcast@gmail.com. Before I get on to the rerun of our discussion of Tan Shui, I wanted to announce something. If you are interested in Chinese literature, there is a publisher you really ought to know. They are Sinoist. That's Sinoist. This is a publisher that's publishing some of the most cutting-edge novels coming out of today's China. They don't do old stuff. They just do writers who are writing right now. They're a great publisher. I think the world of them. The publisher actually sent me something saying they're in Britain doing a road show from October 10th through October 18th. They've got Liang Hong, the author of The Sacred Clan, and Liu Zhenyun, the author of One Day, Three Autumns. And they're touring around the country. It involves, I believe, both authors, along with the publishers, going across Britain. It's basically a book tour. They're stopping in Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, Edinburgh, London, and Oxford. Like I said, this is going to be from October 10th through the 18th. If you happen to be around in the UK, I'd encourage you to go check this out. All right? Without further ado, whatever the Swedish Academy's decision is, here is the episode Rob and I did on Tan Shui's Hut on the Mountain way back in 2018. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. What are we looking at today, Rob?
Talking about a weird one. It's about time we had something weird.
Yeah, it's been a little while. How long has it been since we did really weird?
Well, I don't know. The last time we did something we knew was weird going into it was Ouyang Jianghe's Phoenix.
Ooh, I remember that. That was
I loved it, but
that was not fun.
I thought it was fun. I enjoyed it.
It was our, I think, lowest rated podcast.
I think you may be right. Actually,
you think we can top it today?
I don't know. Let's see.
Or bottom it today?
Let's bottom it today. Let's see if we can get the lowest ratings we've ever had. Actually, I don't think we will, because this one,
it's actually a pretty entertaining. I was going to call it a story, but I'm not entirely sure it is a story.
It feels like a story, but it's not a story. So we're talking about Tan Xue's The Hut on the Mountain.
Yeah.
Now, Tan Xue started writing in the early 80s, so we're talking about still a contemporary piece.
She was some sort of industrial worker for a little while, and then she and her husband started their own small business. She was writing after she had her first child. Really interesting, avant-garde,
very much avant-garde
writer. Her father was editor of Hunan, a Hunan newspaper. He was persecuted from the 1950s on to the 1970s. She was forced to live in a small hut at the foot of a mountain that sort of resembles the hut in the mountain that this story refers to.
On the mountain, Lee, not in the mountain. That would be a level of persecution we have not yet touched on. They buried her in a mountain.
But I guess this is a way for us to jump into the story.
Right.
There are actually two huts on this mountain, or maybe. It's not entirely clear.
Let's just set this up for the listener. Trying to describe what the story is about, quote unquote, is a little bit like trying to tell someone about, say, a Samuel Beckett short story, which you could try to summarize, but it really wouldn't make a difference.
She has drawn, apparently, a lot off of Kafka.
Or reads like Kafka. Whether she has read a lot of Kafka, I don't know. But
so she has read Kafka. She is interested in a lot of Western literature, which is one of the characteristics of avant-garde writers in the late 70s, early 80s. They are, in some ways, they're coming out of the Cultural Revolution searching for what life is supposed to be about. The Communist Party still rules China, but communism as an ideology is dead.
Right. Or as a popular ideology, anyway. Might still be an official ideology in places, but this is very avant-garde in the sense that it's consciously drawing on non-Chinese avant-garde sources like Kafka, like Beckett.
Yeah.
This reads like a young girl's sort of pastoral memories, like it's my life in the countryside sort of thing.
It feels a little bit like a very disjointed diary.
Yeah. So let me just read the first paragraph.
Please.
The reason I'm only going to read the first paragraph is because when you read this paragraph, you think it sets you up for a certain kind of story. So I'm just going to read it very briefly.
Thank you.
On the bleak and barren mountain behind our house stood a wooden hut. Day after day, I busied myself by tidying up my desk drawers. When I wasn't doing that, I would sit in the armchair, my hands on my knees, listening to the tumultuous sounds of the north wind whipping across the fir bark roof of the hut and the howling of the wolves echoing in the valleys. Now,
on a dark and rainy night.
On a dark and rainy night. That could almost be something at a little house on the prairie.
Sure.
You know?
But then the story continues, or it doesn't. It's not really clear.
Now, that's one of the last places in the story where you feel rooted. So you feel like you're in a place, you're almost like a little house on the prairie. Then you get exchanges between family members where they basically just shred all of what reality could be in a story.
Or they shred any notion of communication with each other. I don't know, is there anyone... So they're constantly, just to give the listener a sort of sense of if there was a plot to this story, what it's about. You know, the protagonist is... there, she's trying to clean out her desk in some places, but her mother's constantly going through it. Her sister is rifling through her desk without her permission. She's kind of angry about this. She climbs up the mountain to find this other hut that she says exists on top of the mountain. She's claiming there are wolves running around, there are dogs running around that no one else is seeing, no one's listening to her. When her father says something, she's not listening to him. Her father has a dream about some scissors being left in a well and him dreaming that he goes down to get them, but every time he wakes up, he doesn't. It's just insane. I mean, but I want to get this across to the listener. I say it's insane, but it's kind of a pleasant insanity, right?
Yeah, it is. I consciously compare her to Beckett. I know a lot of people out there probably haven't read much Samuel Beckett. But
we've all read Beckett.
I know. But if you've read...
I'm still waiting for Godot.
Endgame is the one I'm thinking of, because Endgame is a play, and I wish I could summarize it. It's basically a couple of people waiting for the end of the world, or in various places you think it's already happened. But it's also absolutely hilarious. And that's where Beckett sort of brings you into his avant-garde weirdness, is by making it funny. Here...
Tan Shui, do you find her funny?
There is a place in here that I do find funny, and I am going to read this because I circled it. I thought it was really funny. So... back and forth, she and her family go with opening desk drawers and not opening desk drawers.
Going up mountains, not
hearing
going
wolves,
up mountains.
Who knows if they actually did. And then, and for example, just to give you an idea of what we mean by shredding reality, here's an actual quote. Sister's stares were always so pointed that tiny pink measles broke out on my neck. Okay, no, they didn't. There's no possible way they did.
There's another line that I thought that was really good. I'm just going to read it out to you. One day I decided to go up the mountain to find out what on earth was the trouble. As soon as the wind let up, I began to climb. I climbed and climbed for a long time. The sunshine made me dizzy. Tiny white flames were flickering among the pebbles. And that line, tiny white flames were flickering among the pebbles, is repeated 2 or 3 more times in this story. And I just don't know what to make of it. I mean, is she... Oh, I should actually point out, there's no sense. We have no idea of the gender of the protagonist narrator. But we are trying to figure out, is anything real?
Right. And I should point out before I read the paragraph, or the paragraph, a couple of sentences I was going to read as an example of something funny from the text. In a lot of avant-garde art, not just Chinese, the focus shifts from in literature a story or a characters or narrative.
That's a thing with a plot and sequence 1, 2, 3.
It's like it pulls back to focus instead on the mechanics of words themselves. So it becomes a series of word games or philosophical explorations.
So focusing on the essence of language.
Or attempting
not,
to.
Yeah.
The best example, kind of analog I can give is atonal classical music.
Yeah.
I have a weird fascination with Arnold Schoenberg.
Yeah, that's weird.
It is weird.
Stay away from me.
I know. It's too late. We already have a podcast. You're roped in.
I already have your measels.
You already have my tiny measles on the back of your neck. Hey, that would be an amazing name for a band. The atonal measles. Yes. Amazing. That's going to be our next project. Listen for us in a theater near you.
Then we can finally have music to begin and close the podcast.
That'll be our musical alter egos, the atonal measles. I love it. No, but in atonal classical music, what happens is instead of the instruments focusing on a melody, it's like it reverses it. The melody or whatever it is only exists to draw attention to the sounds coming out of the instrument. So what happens is the instruments will cross each other in a way that's unpleasant or discordant, because when it does, you can't continue to just listen to disappear into the music. Now you're focused on, geez, that bassoon sounds weird, which is intentional. You're supposed to think about the instrument and not the song. And here in this story,
the instrument is language, right?
The instrument is language. You have
the song is the story. So there is almost no melody or no plot to this story.
You keep getting the plot interrupted, or a moment of reality that seems like you're tracking, and then it just gets...
Can I ask, do you actually think there is a plot in this story?
I don't know. I don't think so.
It feels like the plot is the hut on the mountain that she climbs the mountain to go see, and that could be a basic sort of plot, right?
Right. When I say that something in this story is funny... In really good, at least in what I think of as really good avant-garde art, there's always a moment when you get sort of a peek into, behind the curtain, as it were. Like, the author sort of lets you know, I do know that this is kind of weird, I promise. And so there's the following sentences I'm going to read. It's sort of towards the end. Of course, whether or not it even counts as the end in a story that doesn't have much of a plot. The narrator says, she's talking about her desk drawers. So, I oiled the sides of the drawers, and by opening and shutting them carefully, I managed to make no noise at all. I repeated this experiment for many days, and the pacing in the next room ceased. She was fooled. This proves you can get away with anything as long as you take a little precaution. Now, that's really funny, and the reason that last line, this proves you can get away with anything as long as you take a little precaution, is funny, is because... Up to this point, most of the sentences we get are just chopped up and discordant. She talks about sweating from the soles of her feet, or flames flickering in the rocks, or measles on her neck. It's just this weird panoply of details. And then you get this one crystal clear, coherent sentence. And it sounds like she's giving people advice, She's like, this proves you can actually do this.
She's almost winking at the reader, right?
It's like she's sitting on stage doing some sort of weird avant-garde play, and then turns to the audience and says, look, I know this is an avant-garde play. Just work with me.
Yeah.
In that moment where you sort of drop the mask, it's funny. It's funny because the experiment or whatever it is being intentionally upstaged by something else. And for me, this is what's exciting about this kind of writing. You have to recalibrate how you read.
Yeah.
You can't read for the story itself because there really isn't one. At some point, you have to sort of read what kind of weird thing is going to happen next? Or is there going to be a moment of humor like this? Or are we going to see the hut disappear? Like, anything can happen in a story like this.
The hut appears, right?
Yeah.
But no other family really believes that it exists on top of the mountain. She's the only one. The narrator is the only one who goes up top, right?
Right. If she even does. And this is part of the fun of the story. Does any of this ever happen?
Yeah.
Is this just nothing but a string of...
That was my question. Does any of this exist?
Well, and this is my thing with this kind of writing. Even, let's just say that everything she's doing here, it's not structured by a plot. She's literally just writing sentences and who knows what's going to happen. It's still entertaining because of the weird little things that the white lights are swaying back and forth, she says.
The language is beautiful, isn't it?
It's beautiful and it's intriguing, and it's exhilarating because you don't know what's going to happen.
The point is to point out the beauty, the aesthetic pleasure that you get just from language. You don't have to have narrative. You don't have to have plot to care about something that someone's writing.
And it's like the best poetry. You can explain it if you want, but ultimately it's just... there's just
it's really
something
nice
about
to
it.
listen to.
Yes.
Really nice to speak it.
And this takes us. Yeah, I'm reading a book right now by a French translator and theorist.
Lame.
It's just because you're not smart enough to track it. It's not my fault. This is who's talking about the loss of bodily rhythm in language. How oral storytelling used to be as much a part of what the body was doing. You sitting in a circle around a fire as what you're actually talking about. Mm-hmm. And there's a certain sense in a lot of avant-garde texts of trying to do that again. Like what if we dropped what anyone thinks of as a narrative and go back to just the way language itself feels as a sort of physical presence?
Can I push back against that?
Please do.
I think that narrative is the one way we make sense of the world. Even our memories, we remember them in terms of narrative. And in fact, I kind of suspect that narrative is a kind of physio-psychological response to the way we remember things. And so narratives are based off of memories, because you can't remember what happened in the past. You are always like constructing a narrative. This is important. That other stuff is not important. So when you construct a narrative, you're necessarily doing more forgetting than you are remembering. Like whenever you have a memory, it's always more about forgetting than it is about remembering. Because when you say, this is important, you're saying all those other things, that stuff that I smelled, the way it felt when I was walking with my feet hitting the ground, that stuff's not important. I'm going to just remember this one specific part of what actually happened. And I think this is pointing out the absurdity of life without narrative. The story is kind of throwing everything at you, like the dreams that you have about the crazy scissors in the well, that concern you have that your dad's actually a wolf, which is something that the narrator suggests at one point. All of that is going into the story, and that's what makes it great.
So for you, it's great in the sense it's kind of a negative object lesson.
I think that's part of what it makes it great, yeah.
Because for me, it's only a negative object lesson if it doesn't work. And if you can't take any pleasure out of it at all, then you're probably right. It's probably just randomness. But if there is something in it that's still interesting, still even riveting, then is it just an object lesson? Or it's like we're going to post a podcast, if we haven't already, about the Jin Pingmei classic Chinese novel. And one of the things that you brought up with that is one of the interpretations which says that it's a Buddhist reading, that there's this much graphic sex. Because if you throw enough of that stuff into a text, eventually people are going to get bored with it and realize just how futile the whole thing is. But, again, the reason it's tricky to use just that reading is because it's so well done and it's still so racy. Yeah. Clearly the writer was doing more than just bombarding us with details.
Clearly the writer was also enjoying himself by writing about this nasty stuff.
And, it's interesting because with this kind of stuff, especially the story we're reading for today, it could be both. Yeah. It could be a negative object lesson, but at the same time, it could also truly be a return to a point when language is a brand new thing that's being explored.
And to get back to a point, I think that's one of the things that great literature does. You can't pin it down and say, it's saying this one thing.
Right.
That's propaganda. If you're reading literature, it has to have some sort of vagueness, and this story is chock full of vagueness.
It's a lot of ambiguity. And to add to that, another thing that I associate with great literature is, do I want to go back and read it again? And this one I do. I want to go back and read this again just because by the time I got to the middle of the story, I realized more or less what was going on or what was not going on, and I'd like to start the story or whatever this is with that in mind.
We've talked about Kafka. We've talked about Jin Pingmei.
Right.
We've talked about Beckett. Did you also feel while reading this that you were reading a kind of homage to Lu Xun?
Yeah, in fact, I did feel that way in a place because, you and I have talked about Diary of a Madman.
Great story.
It does feel like that because in Diary of a Madman also, you and I have had this debate. Is the protagonist of that story really, really looking around and seeing cannibals or not? Because it's written like a diary, and of course, if you have a diary, you assume that whatever's in there is personal and realistic, and they're putting it there just for themselves. They're not trying to fool people. That's the nature of the genre. But is that really what's going on?
This feels kind of like Diary of a Mad Young Girl.
Yes, in but written by Samuel Beckett.
I think that's a great place to end it.
Me too.
All right. Well, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.